For generations, the region now known as the Big Empty has been spoken of in hushed tones by scavengers, prospectors, and wanderers who swear the desert floor itself seems to avoid the crater, as though even the earth remembers what happened there. Yet the true origins of this place lie not in the myths passed around campfires, but in the quiet, meticulously recorded ambitions of pre-war America, for it was here, at the isolated scientific preserve called Big Mountain, that the nation sought to reshape not simply warfare, but the very nature of human existence. When one examines the surviving fragments of information scattered along the wasteland, a portrait emerges of a facility deliberately severed from moral oversight, its administrators rewarded not for restraint but for results, and its scientists chosen not for their steadiness, but for their willingness to push against the limits of what life, mind, and matter could be forced to endure. It is said that Big Mountain did not simply innovate, but consumed ideas like fuel, burning through entire research fields in months, replacing them with ever more radical experiments, and the facility expanded into dozens of domes, research sectors, subterranean networks, and sealed laboratories whose purposes were known only to small cadres of researchers, each sworn to secrecy through binding contracts enforced by intelligence agencies that viewed Big Mountain not as a laboratory, but as the keystone to American supremacy in the looming conflict that would soon engulf the world. The earliest foundations of what would become the think tank lay in the realization by Big Mountain's upper administration that human limitations, fatigue, emotion, ethical hesitation, and the finite working lifespan of the human body were obstacles to the ceaseless pace of experimentation demanded by their government sponsors, and proposals circulated, arguing that the most productive scientists should be freed from the constraints of biology itself, transforming them into beings of pure intellect, whose cognitive functions could be amplified beyond what any organic mind could sustain. These concepts began as theoretical discussions, then prototypes, and finally as formal projects, though the details of the first brain removal trials remain lost, either destroyed or buried under layers of encryption in systems whose access keys died with their creators. What is certain is that by the final decade before the Great War, Big Mountain had already produced early forms of the technologies that would later define the think tank. Neural extraction methods refined to minimize tissue damage, advanced monitors capable of simulating sensory input, reinforced medical shells outfitted with vocalizers and energy emitters, and a growing belief among the senior staff that the body was no longer an integral part of scientific identity, but an inconvenient shell capable of being discarded once intellect alone could be preserved, enhanced, and given the tools to operate machines with a speed and precision no human hand could match. As the global crisis deepened and the ideological standoff between the United States and China spiraled toward catastrophe, Big Mountain's sponsors demanded progress that could provide rapid, overwhelming advantage in every conceivable theater: weaponry, robotics, biological manipulation, psychological conditioning, teleportation prototypes, and other subjects whose surviving notes read more like dark fiction than sanctioned research. Meanwhile, in private conferences sealed from lower-ranked personnel, the most brilliant and eccentric researchers at Big Mountain began discussing what they called the next phase, a transformation not merely of tools, but of the minds wielding them. And these pre-war scientists, already regarded as dangerously unbound by conventional ethics, convinced themselves that only by removing their biological limits could the facility maintain its dominance and ensure that humanity, at least in the form they envisioned it, would survive in an era where physical destruction seemed inevitable. The final preparations for what historians now believe to be the first think tank conversion occurred in the months immediately preceding the Great War, when a number of senior researchers voluntarily entered the surgical domes that would later become infamous for the procedure of separating a person's consciousness from their human form. Witnesses, whose testimonies were later found in scattered logs and damaged audio files, recalled these scientists speaking with excitement, fear, and a near-religious conviction that they were stepping beyond the limits of mortality, accepting a kind of intellectual ascension that would strip away weakness, sentiment, and distraction, leaving only mind and purpose encased within armored shells designed to outlast centuries. The scientists undergoing this transformation expected to emerge as stewards of Big Mountain's future, prepared to shepherd American innovation through the war and beyond. But, like many pre-war ambitions, events outside their control reshaped everything. For, on October 23rd, when the Great War's nuclear fire consumed the world in a matter of hours, Big Mountain's isolation spared it the instant annihilation suffered by so many other sites. Yet catastrophe arrived not through blast, but through the sudden loss of all national oversight, communication, and leadership. Sealed within their sterilized domes and protected laboratories, the newly ascended researchers, now existing as disembodied minds relying on circuitry, sensors, and mechanical interfaces, awoke to a world whose governments had perished, whose cities burned, and whose surviving military authority could no longer command a facility that had been built to require the highest authorization codes, now lost forever beneath the ashes of the old world. Many of the surviving logs suggest that the shock of the Great War's aftermath struck the early think tank with a mixture of grief, terror, and liberation. Yet, as days turned to weeks and weeks into years, these scientists experienced the first unintended consequence of their transformation: the slow degradation of their own psychological stability. For in discarding their bodies, they had also shed the chemical regulators, hormones, instinctive biological rhythms, and the subtle emotional feedback loops that anchor the human mind to empathy, grounded reasoning, and continuity of self. And without these stabilizing elements, their personalities began to drift, distort, and fragment, leaving them trapped in immortal shells while their thoughts spiraled unmoored, unable to fully comprehend their new condition. The isolation of the crater, coupled with the sealed nature of the facility, amplified the problem, and each think tank member responded differently. Some became fixated on specific research subjects, repeating experiments endlessly in pursuit of goals they no longer remembered defining. Others developed irrational fears, obsessions, or paranoias, and still others adopted theatrical personas, masking their disintegrating identities beneath grandiose declarations and exaggerated behaviors, as though performing a role in a play meant only for machines. In these early decades, the Big Empty, as it came to be called by scattered travelers who survived brief encounters with its dangers, transformed from a pre-war wonder of engineering into a haunted monument of malfunctioning technologies, deranged experiments, territorial security systems, and increasingly erratic researchers drifting through the sterile halls of the think tank command dome, convinced they were still humanity's greatest minds, yet unable to recognize how far they had drifted from anything resembling human thought. Among the more coherent logs recovered by later explorers are references to disputes over leadership, territory within the facility, the purpose of continuing research in a world where national sponsors no longer existed, and the persistent, growing fear that their post-human condition left them vulnerable to unforeseen threats, especially the possibility that biological humans might return, seek control over Big Mountain's technologies, or even attempt to reverse engineer the think tank's own transformations. leading some members to argue that the facility must remain sealed forever, and that no outsider should be allowed to witness what they had become. Over time, these fears solidified into doctrine, and the think tank began treating the crater as its own sovereign domain, guarded by defense systems, experimental creatures, and devices originally designed for battlefield use, now repurposed to maintain the isolation and secrecy they believed essential to their existence. The final link to the origins of the Big Empty lies in the moment when the think tank, no longer able to reconcile their memories of humanity with their present forms, embraced the philosophy that would define their later behavior, that the world beyond Big Mountain was no longer their concern, that only scientific progress, however deranged, directionless, or destructive, mattered, and that they themselves were the last true inheritors of human intellect, even as their own minds deteriorated. Thus, the Big Empty, born as a monument to scientific ambition, reshaped by atomic fire, and stewarded by beings who had once been human, became a realm suspended between the ruins of the old world and the nightmares of a future that never came to pass. And the think tank, descendants of the brightest minds of pre-war civilization, emerged as both the architects of the crater's continued evolution and the victims of their own hubris, living echoes of a nation that believed knowledge could be divorced from responsibility, and that intellect alone could guide humanity through any storm, unaware that the greatest storm they faced came from within themselves. In the decades leading up to the Great War, the institution known as Big Mountain Research and Development Center was not merely another pre-war facility hidden within the American Southwest, but the apex of a vast and intricate network of classified laboratories, military black sites, and corporate contractors whose public roles concealed their true allegiance to the nation's most secretive agencies. For the United States government, already deeply entrenched in an escalating technological arms race with China, had come to view scientific advancement not as an auxiliary function of national defense, but as the decisive battleground on which the future of global power would be won, and thus it poured enormous, largely untraceable funding into Big Mountain, granting the site extraordinary autonomy and near limitless license to pursue any avenue of research, no matter how dangerous, ethically dubious, or destabilizing its results might be. Internal correspondence recovered in fragmented holotapes reveals that Big Mountain's administrators were bound to a trinity of sponsors: the Department of Defense, whose brass cared only for battlefield applications; the Office of Science and Industry, which craved breakthroughs capable of reshaping civilian infrastructure and industrial production; and shadowy agencies, likely roots of the intelligence networks that would later evolve into organizations such as the pre-war intelligence directorates, whose motives were never explicitly documented, but whose influence over certain projects suggests an interest in psychological manipulation, mind-altering technologies, and deeper experiments whose implications remain unclear even 2 centuries later. These sponsors operated under a veil of secrecy so absolute that even high-ranking military officials were barred from accessing full summaries of Big Mountain's activities, and most believed the facility was concerned only with minor prototyping, unaware that entire branches of experimental science had been handed wholesale to teams of researchers encouraged to push beyond the boundaries of restraint. Among the earliest and most significant projects authorized under the pre-war mandate was the development of advanced energy weaponry, which soon diverged from conventional military designs and entered territory so experimental that field commanders refused to deploy many prototypes due to instability, unreliability, or unpredictable side effects. Yet the government's appetite for innovation remained insatiable, and so Big Mountain's researchers created increasingly volatile devices, plasma casting arrays, unstable laser harmonics, weaponized particle oscillators, that would later be found scattered throughout the Mojave or incorporated into the strange machines still humming within the crater. Another branch of research, operating under code names so cryptic that their purpose was initially incomprehensible to later analysts, focused on biological engineering through forced mutation, gene splicing, and hybridization, experiments that yielded not only the infamous Night Stalker but also a series of prototypes whose existence is attested only by brief, redacted memos, reference, in containment breaches, euthanization procedures, or the sudden disappearance of entire research wings. The most ambitious of these biological projects drew heavily on data stolen from rival nations. Though the government never acknowledged the origins of certain genetic materials that arrived in sealed containers escorted by military convoys, and it is widely believed among post-war historians that the government's real aim was not merely to enhance soldiers, but to engineer entirely new forms of life capable of surviving conditions that would render human troops obsolete. Parallel to these biological pursuits was the development of psychological manipulation technologies, including devices designed to influence behavior, implant memories, or extract information through non-invasive neural stimulation, an initiative strongly pushed by intelligence sponsors who saw the human mind as the final frontier of warfare. And though many trials showed promise in controlled settings, the techniques proved unstable and often resulted in catastrophic psychological damage, leading the intelligence agencies to shift their interests toward the more extreme notion of total mind replacement, an idea that would indirectly pave the way for the think tank's transformation decades later. Yet the crown jewel of Big Mountain's pre-war mandate was neither weaponry nor biological modification, but the ambitious and deeply flawed push toward energy-based transportation and matter disassembly research. For one of the site's largest domes, the building now known to explorers as the X-8 and X-13 Sector C complexes housed sprawling arrays of prototype matter transference systems, teleportation relays, and molecular deconstruction chambers, each built with the intention of rendering traditional logistics obsolete, allowing instant movement of troops, supplies, and information across vast distances. However, field testing revealed severe dissonance in the stabilization fields, resulting in subjects reappearing with missing limbs, scrambled neural patterns, or in the worst cases reconstituted in forms that defied classification. And after a series of failed trials, the Department of Defense quietly shelved the project, though Big Mountain's scientists, unwilling to abandon their work, continued refining the theories long after their sponsors had withdrawn official interest. Beneath these high-profile projects existed entire layers of clandestine research so compartmentalized that only a handful of individuals across the nation understood their true scope, such as the long-rumored personality suppression initiative, aimed at replacing human decision-making with programmable behavioral profiles, a disturbing program that blended psychological reconditioning, cybernetics, and experimental pharmaceuticals, resulting in early prototypes of personality segregation software and automated systems capable of mimicking human traits. Technologies that would later manifest in the anthropomorphized AIs scattered throughout the sink. Equally shrouded in secrecy was the clandestine study of pre-war anomalies, a field dedicated to analyzing unusual energy signatures, unexplained geophysical disturbances, and rare materials recovered from crash sites or abandoned government expeditions, some of which yielded reactive substances studied in Big Mountain's geological labs, though the purpose of this initiative was deliberately obscured. suggesting that at least one sponsor sought to understand forces that even the science of the time could not fully describe. Within this labyrinth of sanctioned and unsanctioned research, the scientists themselves evolved into a distinct culture, driven not by the war effort, though they often cited national security as justification, but by a competitive obsession with pushing boundaries, and this culture was cultivated through incentive systems designed by their government handlers. Promotions were awarded not for safety or reliability, but for novelty and breakthroughs, regardless of collateral damage, leading to a steady escalation of risk-taking behavior that transformed the facility into a crucible of outlandish ideas and unstable experiments. These conditions, combined with Big Mountain's remote location and self-contained infrastructure, created an environment in which failures were rarely punished, and disasters, chemical leaks, genetic escapes, AI malfunctions, radiation spills, were brushed aside as the cost of progress, while the casualties, often technicians or junior researchers, were simply replaced, their deaths sealed under classified designations and never reported beyond the facility's walls. The culture of secrecy extended to the highest levels of government, where classified committees reviewed Big Mountain's quarterly summaries but were presented only with carefully curated highlights, while the more dangerous or ethically questionable projects were relegated to sections marked operational unknowns, a designation that effectively shielded them from oversight. Even the name Big Mountain was a facade, for the site was officially referred to in federal documents only through its internal codename, with all public references expunged as though the facility had never existed. This secrecy was reinforced by psychological conditioning protocols applied to certain staff members, ensuring that if they ever left the facility, voluntarily or through transfer, fragments of their memory concerning their most sensitive work would remain sealed behind artificial mental partitions. But these procedures were imperfect, resulting in at least one recorded case of a scientist suffering a complete nervous collapse after being reassigned to a civilian research post. The relationship between the sponsors grew increasingly strained as the Great War approached, with the Department of Defense demanding practical, deployable weapons, the Office of Science and Industry pushing for breakthroughs that could revolutionize domestic manufacturing, and the intelligence agencies pressuring Big Mountain to accelerate its work on neural manipulation and cybernetic integration. Yet, rather than moderating the scope of the facility, these conflicting demands pushed Big Mountain further into reckless experimentation, each sponsor believing that the others were receiving preferential access to the facility's discoveries, and each attempting to co-opt the scientists through individualized contracts, classified requests, or untraceable funding injections. The scientists, recognizing their leverage, exploited this rivalry to secure greater autonomy, arguing that compartmentalization was essential for security, though in truth they sought the freedom to conduct experiments that even their most extremist sponsors might have forbidden. By the final year before the Great War, Big Mountain had become a black hole of research resources, absorbing materials, personnel, and funding at a rate that alarmed some analysts within the government, yet no agency dared to curtail the facility's operations, fearing that any disruption might jeopardize the breakthroughs that military leaders believed could tip the coming conflict in America's favor. As geopolitical tensions escalated and the science community throughout the nation scrambled to produce innovations that could address energy shortages, environmental failures, and the rising specter of global conflict, Big Mountain's researchers grew increasingly convinced that the old world was nearing its end, and this conviction spurred them to accelerate their most dangerous projects, including the early phase experiments that would culminate in the think tank's transformation. The scientists did not explicitly plan for the Great War, nor did they anticipate the scale of destruction that would follow, but they believed that the United States' survival depended on technological superiority so absolute that victory would be assured before the enemy could respond. A belief that led to the creation of prototypes so volatile that some were locked away behind sealed blast doors never meant to be opened again. When the bombs finally fell on October 23rd, Big Mountain was already operating at full emergency readiness, though no one within the government reached the facility with new directives or evacuation orders, and so the scientists, cut off from external command, assumed, correctly, that the nation had been dealt a fatal blow. Yet, even in the hours after the world fell silent, Big Mountain's systems continued to function, its reactors humming, its security protocols tightening, and its researchers retreating further into their domes, where they prepared to enact the very procedures that would transform them from human beings into the post-war minds now known as the think tank. Thus, the pre-war mandate of Big Mountain, forged in secrecy and fueled by ambition, laid the foundation for the existence of a post-human scientific enclave that would outlast the nation that built it. And in retrospect, it becomes clear that the hidden sponsors, whether motivated by fear, hubris, or a desperate belief in technological salvation, unwittingly created the conditions for a legacy of unchecked experimentation and moral collapse that would echo through the centuries, turning a mountain of innovation into the wasteland, now feared and whispered of across the Mojave as the Big Empty. In the first hours following the Great War, when the world beyond Big Mountain vanished beneath clouds of radioactive dust, and the last signals from the nation's command networks sputtered into static, the surviving scientists sealed within the crater found themselves at a crossroads they had long theorized but never expected to confront so suddenly, for as the shock of nuclear devastation rippled across the continent, the facility's monitoring arrays displayed the collapse of every major city, the termination of every external contact, and the irreversible destruction of the institutions that once directed Big Mountain's work, leaving the researchers trapped within a fortified sanctuary surrounded by the echoing silence of a world that had ended. Though the facility had been designed with extensive contingency plans, these protocols assumed a temporary disruption, not the total erasure of civilization, and as the full magnitude of the event became clear, the scientists divided into factions, some arguing for an immediate evacuation toward perceived safe zones, others insisting that sheltering in place was the only logical course, and still others, particularly those involved in the early phases of the neural separation project, contending that the Great War had validated their belief that human bodies were fragile, obsolete forms ill-suited to survive the age that had just dawned. Over the following days, the facility's atmosphere deteriorated from coordinated crisis response into chaos. For while Big Mountain had survived the immediate blasts, the shock waves disrupted power lines, breached storage chambers, and awakened dormant defense systems that interpreted the sudden communications blackout as an attack, activating patrol drones, automated turrets, and experimental constructs that began firing on anything that moved, forcing the researchers to retreat deeper into their respective domes and lock down sectors of the crater to regain control. The scientists who had already begun preparing for the radical cognitive migration, figures like Dr. Klein, Dr. Dahler, Dr. Boris, Dr. Zero, Dr. 8, and several pre-conversion colleagues whose names are now lost, interpreted the chaos as a sign that the world outside Big Mountain was no longer capable of sustaining humanity, and that the facility, with its sealed environments and advanced machinery, was the only viable refuge left. But even this haven was failing, for the reactors strained under irregular loads, oxygen scrubbers required constant maintenance, and several laboratories suffered radiation seepage from the surrounding landscape, further pushing the researchers toward the realization that survival in human form would require monumental effort with diminishing likelihood of long-term success. In this atmosphere of despair and urgency, the neural extraction and rehousing project, originally intended as a long-term research initiative, was thrust into the forefront as a desperate solution, its theoretical risks overshadowed by the certainty of death. If the scientists remained dependent on their decaying biological forms, and over a series of frantic counsels, heated arguments, and emergency authorizations, the senior staff made the fateful decision to implement what they called the Total Cognitive Preservation Protocol, a plan to convert the most essential researchers into cybernetic entities capable of functioning indefinitely within the controlled environment of Big Mountain. The conversion process itself, later mythologized as a dark rite performed in the sterilized surgical domes, involved the isolation of the subject's brain, removal of all biological tissue deemed non-essential, disconnection from the endocrine and nervous systems, and integration with a complex network of computational matrices designed to emulate sensory perception through artificial means. And though the scientists had tested aspects of the system on smaller organisms and theoretical models, none had anticipated the psychological ramifications of severing the brain from its body. For human identity had always been shaped by physical experience, breathing, heartbeat, hormonal regulation, tactile feedback, and the removal of these functions created a cognitive void that the researchers attempted to fill with mechanical substitutes, sensory remapping, and artificial stabilizers designed to prevent mental collapse. Despite these precautions, the first volunteers awoke from the procedure disoriented, panicked, and suffering from what logs describe as cognitive drift, a condition characterized by fragmented memories, heightened emotional volatility, and difficulty reconciling the absence of their physical forms with the overwhelming sensory inputs provided by their new mechanical bodies. Yet once the initial shock faded, many reported a euphoria born from heightened perception, amplified intellect, and a strange, floating sensation of existing without pain, fatigue, or hunger, a liberation that some liken to enlightenment. Though even in these early accounts one can detect the seeds of the instability that would later define the think tank. As more researchers underwent the transformation, the psychological effects varied widely. Some adapted with remarkable speed, while others experienced hallucinations, emotional flattening, obsessive fixation on narrow subjects, or complete dissociation from their former identities. And the facility's medical staff, unable to treat conditions that no longer fit any biological framework, attempted to recalibrate the mechanical shells to regulate neural activity, only to discover that each scientist's cognitive patterns reacted differently to the artificial interfaces, making uniform stability impossible. These complications were further compounded by the loss of several unconverted staff members, who attempted to flee the crater after witnessing the early stages of the project, vanishing into the irradiated wastes or being killed by Big Mountain's malfunctioning security systems, leaving behind only encrypted logs describing the emerging culture within the domes as a schism between body and mind, marking the moment when the post-human faction began to consolidate control over the facility. Meanwhile, those who had undergone the conversion embraced their new forms, not merely as a means of survival, but as an evolutionary step, and in their isolation, cut off from the physical cues that once grounded their emotions, they began to exhibit exaggerated personalities. Dr. Klein adopting a grandiose authoritarian tone, Dr. Zero obsessing over displays of electrical genius, while denying the existence of the number 0, Dr. Boris spiraling into guilt-ridden attempts to recreate his lost childhood dog through genetic manipulation, and Dr. Dahler developing an academic fascination with organic physiology bored, erring on fetishistic curiosity, all symptoms of what later analysts would describe as post-human psychological distortion, a condition in which amplified intelligence and sensory abstraction magnified traits that would have remained balanced in an organic mind. Despite these emerging eccentricities, the newly transformed researchers believed they were humanity's last hope, convinced that their enhanced intellect and immortality placed them at the forefront of rebuilding civilization, yet without external guidance, ethical restraint, or stable emotional grounding, their priorities drifted, and projects once intended to serve national security devolved into self-referential experiments conducted out of habit, curiosity, or delusion, leading to the creation of increasingly dangerous prototypes, robotic predators, autonomous defense drones, weaponized fauna, and the infamous trauma harnesses that continued to walk the crater long after their occupants had died. As years turned into decades, the think tank, though not yet calling itself by that name, grew increasingly isolated within its central dome, severing communication with the outer research sectors, abandoning maintenance on systems deemed unimportant, and allowing entire wings of Big Mountain to fall into ruin, their automated systems continuing whatever experiments had been in progress at the time of the Great War, creating pockets of unpredictable danger scattered throughout the crater. The scientists' memory of the outside world faded into fragmented recollections, distorted by the absence of physical grounding. And without new input or human interaction, their minds spiraled further into abstraction, eventually losing all connection to the ethics, accountability, and collaborative reasoning that once defined their pre-war identities. Over time, the researchers rebranded themselves, not as survivors or custodians of human knowledge, but as the premier intellects of a new era, beings beyond the limitations of flesh, their authority justified by their belief that only they possessed the clarity to continue the pursuit of science unburdened by the failings of human emotion, even as their judgment deteriorated. This ideological shift culminated in the creation of their collective designation, the think tank, a name that reflected both their pride in their intellectual supremacy and their inability to perceive how far their minds had drifted from coherent scientific thought. And by the century mark following the Great War, the transformation was complete. The scientists who had once guided Big Mountain were gone, replaced by volatile, ego-driven intellects trapped in armored shells, interpreting the world through distorted sensory filters, and clinging to the belief that their continued experimentation served a grand purpose. Thus, the Great War, which had destroyed nations and civilizations across the globe, did not directly destroy Big Mountain, but it shattered the humanity of those within it, leaving behind beings who had preserved their brains but lost their souls, architects of a post-war legacy defined not by progress but by madness, isolation, and the eternal hum of machinery sustaining minds that no longer remembered the meaning of being human. In the long, disorienting years after the think tank completed its transformation into post-human intellects suspended within armored shells, a new and terrible need arose within the sealed systems of Big Mountain. For while the scientists had shed their bodies in pursuit of unfettered cognition, the facility itself remained a sprawling, decaying labyrinth of machinery, laboratories, testing chambers, and sprawling maintenance corridors that required constant physical upkeep, valves that needed manual resetting, reactors that demanded calibration, chemical spills that required containment, and vast storage wings filled with hazardous materials that could only be accessed by beings with hands, lungs, muscles, and the capacity to move freely through terrain no mechanical shell could safely navigate. In their pre-war form, the scientists would have relied upon technicians, engineers, custodial staff, and military personnel assigned to the facility, but these individuals were long gone, killed during the Great War's aftermath, lost in the chaotic early days of the crater lockdown, or simply unaccounted for as they fled into the irradiated wastes, and the surviving think tank members, despite their immense intellect, soon discovered that their new forms, though powerful in computation, were severely limited in dexterity and mobility, a flaw that not only hindered their daily operations, but threatened the continued survival of Big Mountain itself. Thus, the researchers faced a grim decision: either re-engineer their mechanical shells for full mobility, an endeavor that would have required years of uninterrupted, coordinated effort far beyond their fractured mental stability, or create a new class of beings who could perform the tasks essential to the facility's upkeep. And in their increasingly unstable logic, they chose the latter, concluding that the most expedient solution was to repurpose living beings into obedient, disposable laborers stripped of the capacity for rebellion or independent thought. The concept of the lobotomite began not as a deliberate cruelty, but as a pragmatic response to the think tank's physical limitations. Yet the execution of the idea revealed how deeply the scientists' moral frameworks had decayed. For, rather than develop advanced robotic assistants or reprogram existing security drones, they turned to the medical and neurological equipment left over from the pre-war mind alteration projects, specifically the cranial tampering tools used in abandoned experiments involving behavioral suppression, memory partitioning, and motor control modification. Devices, originally intended for battlefield trauma treatment or prisoner interrogation, now repurposed to produce a workforce capable of manual labor but devoid of humanity. The earliest lobotomization procedures were crude and often lethal, involving the removal or destruction of critical sections of the frontal lobe, the insertion of cybernetic implants to override motor functions, and the application of chemical cocktails designed to suppress higher cognition while enhancing muscular endurance. And many of the first test subjects captured wasteland, scavengers, feral test animals, and in some cases pre-war corpses reanimated through experimental harnesses, failed to survive the process, leaving the think tank with a string of failures that they treated not as tragedies, but as data points in an ongoing refinement cycle. Over time, the procedure stabilized into a consistent method of producing lobotomites, shuffling, slack-jawed figures with limited awareness, heightened pain tolerance, and bodies marked by surgical scars, metal braces, implanted control nodes, and crude modifications intended to optimize them for specific tasks, whether hauling machinery, scrubbing reactor conduits, running physical errands across the crater, or serving as expendable test subjects in hazardous experiments. The think tank considered too dangerous for anything they valued. The think tank viewed the lobotomites not as sentient beings but as biological tools, empty vessels created for utility rather than existence, and their decision to strip away the subjects' identities reflected a deeper philosophical collapse within the domes. For the scientists, having abandoned their own humanity, no longer recognized it in others, and in their eyes, the lobotomites served as a mirror of what they believed biological life had become: obsolete, inconvenient, and unworthy of preservation. Yet the tragedy behind the lobotomites lies not merely in their creation, but in their origins. For many of the individuals captured and converted into these shambling workers were fully conscious wasteland wanderers who had unknowingly ventured too close to the crater, only to be seized by patrol drones, stunned by experimental restraint beams, and dragged into surgical domes where their protests were dismissed as irrelevant noise, their memories erased or overwritten, and their autonomy stolen in the name of scientific necessity. A small number of logs recovered centuries later contain fragmented audio of terrified subjects pleading with unseen figures as machines whirred around them, begging to be released, promising not to speak of what they had seen, swearing they were only passing through, and asking why no one would answer their questions. Their voices met only with the dispassionate hum of sterile equipment and the detached commentary of think tank members who discussed cortical access points and nerve cluster suppression with the same tone one might use to evaluate the performance of a malfunctioning appliance. Early lobotomites were often released into controlled environments for close observation, but as the think tank's paranoia deepened and their interest in monitoring diminished, these creatures were loosed into the wider crater, where they wandered aimlessly across the harsh terrain, becoming both labor force and living hazard, stumbling into restricted zones, triggering security systems, and occasionally being torn apart by more dangerous experiments that had long since escaped containment. Yet even in death, their bodies were often retrieved and reused, fitted with new implants, or converted into autonomous trauma harnesses, granting them a grim form of afterlife as part of the facility's ever-expanding ecosystem of failed human remnants. The think tank's growing reliance on lobotomites also revealed the extent of their detachment from reality. For while the scientists believed these creatures were efficient and obedient, the truth was that lobotomites were prone to unpredictable behavior due to the crude nature of their surgical alterations, often experiencing spasms of instinctual aggression, associative reflexes triggered by sensory confusion, or sudden collapse as neural implants failed, causing widespread malfunctions across maintenance routines that forced the think tank to create even more lobotomites to replace the lost ones, establishing a cycle of exploitation driven by their own inability to maintain stability. Despite these failures, the think tank rationalized the lobotomites' suffering by claiming that stripped minds were free from fear, anxiety, or existential grief, an argument that revealed the depth of their moral decay. For they believed they were alleviating suffering by removing the capacity to feel it, a philosophy that justified endless experimentation on these unfortunate beings, including exposing them to radiation fields, testing advanced surgical tools, fitting them with unstable cybernetic weapon attachments, or forcing them into combat scenarios to evaluate new weaponry, with logs documenting entire chambers filled with the corpses of lobotomites used in weapons calibration trials. One particularly disturbing archive references the behavioral loop initiative, in which lobotomites were subjected to repetitive commands for days or weeks, their movements tracked to measure cognitive erosion, their eyes deteriorating until they simply collapsed. And yet, the think tank members evaluating the project discussed the results with clinical fascination, debating whether the failure was due to insufficient chemical suppression or an inherent flaw in the lobotomite design. For all their suffering, lobotomites occasionally displayed glimmers of residual humanity, moments when a hand trembled with hesitation, when a figure paused before entering a hazardous chamber as though fearing pain, or when two lobotomites moved together in a synchronized pattern resembling cooperation, suggesting that fragments of their former identities remained buried beneath layers of suppression. Yet these moments went unnoticed by the think tank, whose distorted sensory interfaces could no longer interpret such subtleties, and who viewed the lobotomites' behavior only through the lens of utility. As centuries passed, the lobotomites became a defining feature of the Big Empty, their presence marking the boundaries of the crater as surely as the rusted towers and flickering force fields, and travelers who glimpsed them from afar whispered tales of hollow-faced beings wandering beneath the eerie glow of pre-war technology, believing them to be ghosts or cursed remnants of forbidden experiments, which in many ways was true. While the think tank considered them failures of design, the Lobotomites became symbols of the facility's fall from grace, reminders that the scientists had sacrificed not only their own humanity, but that of countless others. Indeed, when the Courier eventually arrived at Big Mountain, a end of the think tank stripped away their brain, spine, and heart in preparation for their own planned conversion. It was only then that the full horror of the Lobotomites was revealed. They were not an anomaly, but the inevitable product of a culture that had come to view the body as an inconvenience, the mind as a resource to be repurposed, and the human being as raw material for experimentation. In this sense, the Lobotomites stand as one of the greatest tragedies of Big Mountain, a population of unwilling subjects transformed into obedient shells, wandering the crater as living evidence of the think tank's descent into madness, victims of a hubris so profound that it reshaped not only the fate of individuals, but the moral landscape of an entire scientific empire that once dreamed of guiding humanity into the future, but instead became a mausoleum of broken minds, forgotten names, and lives carved apart in the name of progress. In the sprawling chronology of Big Mountain, where every dome and crater ridge carries the echo of some long-buried pre-war ambition, no figure stands in such paradoxical contrast to the think tank as the one who once worked alongside them, debated with them, dreamed with them, and ultimately broke from them in a schism that defined the fate of the entire facility. Dr. Mobius, the self-proclaimed warden of the Forbidden Zone, a figure whose name has become synonymous with both scientific brilliance and erratic eccentricity, yet whose actions, often dismissed by the think tank as the ravings of a malfunctioning intellect, were grounded in a clarity of purpose unmatched by any who remained within the main complex. For Mobius alone recognized that the long decay of Big Mountain was not merely a matter of crumbling structures or malfunctioning drones, but the consequence of a deeper intellectual rot within the surviving researchers, a paranoia-fueled unraveling that threatened to spill beyond the crater and reshape the Mojave in the image of their fractured, post-human minds. To understand Mobius is to look beyond the intimidating projection of his enormous screen visage and the battalions of mechanized scorpions that patrol his desert fortress, and instead trace his journey from celebrated pre-war neurologist and cybernetic innovator to the enigmatic sovereign of the crater's most restricted zone. For Mobius was once among the brightest of Big Mountain's scientific elite, renowned for his work in memory manipulation, cerebral reinforcement, and neural isolation, fields that became foundational to the transformation of the think tank members into the disembodied intellects they would later become. And though it is difficult to reconstruct the exact timeline of the schism between Mobius and his former colleagues, surviving logs and internal records paint a picture of a man increasingly disturbed by the directions in which Big Mountain's research trajectory was drifting, long before the Great War's firestorms lit the sky. Among pre-war scientists, Mobius was known for his obsessive focus on psychological resilience, believing that the greatest threat to scientific progress was not technological limitation, but the fragility of the human mind when confronted with stress, fear, or moral contradiction, and he lobbied for mental safeguards, ethical circuitry, and psychological supervision protocols to be placed upon all large-scale research units, proposals that the broader staff ignored as unnecessary hindrances, yet which in hindsight read as desperate attempts to prevent the descent into madness that would later engulf the think tank. When the war erupted and Big Mountain sealed itself behind layers of automated defenses, the surviving scientists, Mobius among them, initiated the final stage of their planned metamorphosis into post-human cognition, a process intended to preserve the brightest minds of the age through the annihilation of biological limitation. But something in those final pre-conversion days changed Mobius profoundly, for he emerged from the transformation differently than his peers, where the others gradually succumbed to a frenzied mixture of fragmented memory, intellectual obsession, and escalating detachment from morality. Mobius retained in his disembodied state an unusually potent sense of the past, the ethical weight of their actions, and the urgent need to safeguard the world from the very minds who now claimed to be its last remaining guardians. Once the think tank solidified control of the main facility, Mobius began withdrawing his participation from shared research, redirecting supply drones to the remote zone that would later become his fortress, siphoning off resources with the silent efficiency of a man preparing for a future conflict he believed inevitable. And as his former colleagues grew suspicious of his withdrawal, interpreting it through their paranoia-distorted sensory feeds as hostile activity, tensions escalated, resulting in a permanent rupture that split the once unified cohort of Big Mountain's greatest intellects into two opposing factions: the think tank, whose unchecked experimentation threatened to spill outward into the Mojave, and Mobius, who positioned himself as the only bulwark capable of containing them, even if it meant becoming the very monster they feared. Thus, the legend of Dr. Mobius, as a rogue scientist, was born not from malice or delusion, but from the necessity of becoming a deterrent. For Mobius understood that the think tank, freed from ethical restraint and consumed by isolation, would eventually look outward for new subjects, new test beds, and new territories to reshape. And so he adopted a strategy that seemed irrational on its surface, yet was grounded in metic, long-term planning. He cultivated the image of the quintessential mad scientist, an unpredictable and dangerous force dwelling in the heart of the most forbidden region of Big Mountain, surrounding himself with walls of experimental radiation, swarms of hostile automatons, deceptive broadcasts, and coded warnings projected across the crater so that the think tank would come to fear him more than they hungered for expansion, a fear that Mobius nurtured with deliberate theatricality, knowing that only by convincing them that he posed a threat greater than any they could comprehend could he freeze their ambitions in place. Central to this strategy was the development of the Robo-Scorpion legions, towering automatons shaped in the image of scorpions, creatures Mobius had long admired for their adaptability, venomous efficiency, and symbolic association with danger, whose heavy armor plating, multi-segment targeting arrays, and high-output energy emitters made them ideally suited not only for patrolling hazardous terrain, but for presenting an unmistakably aggressive silhouette to any think tank reconnaissance drones that wandered too close. These machines, despite their daunting appearance, were never intended for conquest, but rather as sentinels, designed to create the illusion of overwhelming military strength, a mechanized barrier that would discourage incursions into the Forbidden Zone while requiring minimal direct oversight. And their construction was a personal project for Mobius, who poured into them not only technological ingenuity, but psychological strategy, equipping them with glowing sensor arrays, stuttering broadcast tones, and intimidating stances that made them appear more unpredictable and hostile than their actual programming allowed, an exaggeration that proved remarkably effective in keeping the think tank at bay. Yet Mobius's strategy extended beyond mere intimidation, for he also engineered the Forbidden Zone's interior as a labyrinth of misleading data records, decoy research terminals, malfunctioning memory loops, and distorted holographic reports claiming that he was amassing weapons of unprecedented power, conducting arcane brain experiments, or preparing a world-altering ascent that would make the think tank hesitate before provoking him. And while these logs read like the ravings of a mind addled by broken sensory filters, the truth is that Mobius crafted them with careful precision. Understanding that the think tank's greatest vulnerability was psychological, and that the best way to contain them was to feed them a steady diet of exaggerated threats they would be too fearful or confused to challenge. His decision to flood his own fortress with controlled doses of chems, primarily mentats, though his inventory also contained numerous experimental variants, was part of this gambit. For Mobius believed that maintaining a partially altered cognitive pattern would allow him to better emulate the erratic behavior expected of a foe the think tank would hesitate to confront directly. And, though this habit contributed to his disjointed speech and eccentric mannerisms, it also masked the deeper clarity he preserved beneath chemical fog. A clarity that emerges only in his most unguarded moments, when he speaks of responsibility, containment, and the horrors he has spent centuries preventing. His relationship with the think tank became increasingly defined by deliberate miscommunication, Mobius sending cryptic, threatening broadcasts that barely concealed warnings about experimental failures that might leak into the crater if oversight was not maintained, while the think tank interpreted these signals as hostile declarations requiring defensive escalation. Unaware that Mobius was simultaneously sabotaging their long-range transmitters, redirecting their drones, and altering their memory logs to keep them perpetually confused about the true state of Big Mountain. Over time, Mobius came to inhabit the role he had crafted, speaking through a towering screen-bound visage that loomed over intruders with the voice of a theatrical villain, yet always stopping short of direct aggression unless forced, for he understood that his greatest weapon was not violence but uncertainty, and he maintained this fragile equilibrium for centuries, holding back the think tank's expansion even as his own equipment degraded and his base fell into disrepair, its rusting consoles illuminated by flickering static that masked the exhaustion of a mind burdened by a responsibility too great for any one being. When the Courier eventually entered Big Mountain, Mobius recognized immediately the danger they posed to the balance he had maintained, for the arrival of an outsider with intact cognition threatened to expose the truth to the think tank, destabilize their paranoia, and collapse the manufactured stalemate that had kept the Mojave safe for generations. And so he attempted, through misdirection, automated defenses, and desperate entreaties, to maintain control of a situation that had finally exceeded even his careful designs. Yet, behind every action he took lay the same intention that had driven him from the think tank long ago: to protect the world from the unrestrained minds of Big Mountain, even at the cost of appearing as its greatest threat. In the end, Dr. Mobius remains one of the crater's most tragic figures, a scientist who accepted the burden of containment by becoming the very villain he feared his colleagues would otherwise become. A guardian whose methods were flawed, whose mind was fraying, but whose purpose, preserving the delicate boundary between the crater's horrors and the world beyond, was rooted in a clarity that none of his peers possessed. And though the Robo-Scorpion legions still patrol the sands, and the Forbidden Zone remains a maze of half-functioning defenses, the legacy of Mobius is found not in the machines he built, nor the facade he maintained, but in the decades of silent vigilance during which he alone stood between the Mojave and the unchecked nightmares of Big Mountain, a solitary sentinel whose sacrifice remains buried beneath layers of eccentricity, chemical haze, and mechanized theatrics, yet whose actions shaped the fate of the wasteland in ways few will ever fully comprehend. In the long chronicle of Big Mountain's peculiar customs and fractured scientific dogma, few events better reveal the psychological unraveling of the think tank than the moment they seized the Courier upon the latter's arrival, an incident that the researchers themselves described not as an attack, abduction, or interrogation, but as a reclamation, a ritualistic process they believed necessary for maintaining what they called the intellectual integrity of their isolated domain. And this strange choice of language, so casual, so clinical, so utterly divorced from the lived experience of the captured traveler, offers a window into the distorted worldview the scientists had developed across 2 centuries of sensory confinement and near absolute detachment from human norms. When the Courier first stepped through the shimmering barrier of the facility's outer perimeter, the think tank's surveillance systems detected the intrusion with a mix of alarm and fascination, for they interpreted any human figure capable of navigating the crater's hazards as a potential anomaly, an intruder whose presence must be immediately contextualized, categorized, and neutralized before its intentions could corrupt the delicate balance they believed they had preserved, and thus the facility's automated restraint beams, devices originally designed for containing pre-war test subjects, activated with blinding speed, overwhelming the traveler before any resistance could be attempted, while aerial drones and lobotomite handlers converged with mechanical precision, spiriting the unconscious figure into the heart of the think tank's central dome, where preparations for the so-called extraction rites had already begun. To the scientists, whose minds had long abandoned the notion of bodily integrity, the human form was no more sacred than a worn-out tool, a vessel whose components could be rearranged or removed without moral hesitation, and thus when they initiated the process of separating the Courier's brain, spine, and heart from the body, they did so with an unsettling mixture of glee and ceremony, speaking in tones that suggested they believed themselves to be performing an act of intellectual liberation rather than mutilation, congratulating one another on their surgical expertise, debating who would catalogue the resulting organs, and arguing over whether the newly separated brain might offer insights into the neurological resilience of Mojave inhabitants, while never once considering that the consciousness within might object to the procedure. Each member of the think tank approached the event according to their own fractured priorities. Dr. Klein, ever convinced that all biological life existed to be remodeled in the image of post-human intellect, saw the Courier's separation from the body as a mandatory initiation into their realm. Dr. Dala fixated obsessively on the musculature and skeletal structure of the inert body, speaking with unnerving fascination about the supposed beauty of the organic form, even as she displayed a total inability to comprehend its significance. Dr. Zero, whose malfunctioning voice algorithms rendered him incapable of speech without distortion, attempted, in his own way, to welcome the brain as a new colleague, while Dr. Boris, intoxicated by memories of past experiments and the glory he believed lost to time, insisted that the organs be catalogued for later behavioral modification trials, and Dr. 8, whose linguistic systems had fractured into rhythmic bursts of static, hovered in a perpetual loop of excitement and confusion, interpreting the entire event as a triumphant acquisition of a new research subject rather than an abduction. To these scientists, the ritual served not only as a means of securing the Courier's compliance, but as a reaffirmation of their own identity, for every time they separated a living being from its biological components, they reinforced the belief that their own transition into post-human intellect represented the pinnacle of scientific progress. And through this cyclical validation, they maintained the delusion that they were the rightful stewards of Big Mountain's knowledge, Even though their understanding of the world had been eroded by centuries of sensory instability and recursive memory decay, the Courier, once revived in the think tank's central dome, found themselves suspended in a nightmarish form of partial existence, a living consciousness aware of its disembodiment, confronted by a ring of floating machines whose screens displayed distorted caricatures of human faces, each speaking with wild, contradictory enthusiasm about the honor of being inducted into their domain. And though the Courier's thoughts were intact, they quickly learned that the scientists viewed them not as an equal but as a resource, an inconveniently self-aware one, perhaps, but still a resource, and as the think tank explained, in fragmented, overlapping monologues, that the organs had been removed to protect both the Courier and the facility. The true horror of the event became apparent. The scientists genuinely believed that by stripping away biological components, they were granting the so-called initiates freedom from the dangers of flesh, a warped philosophy born from their belief that the body was nothing more than a liability capable of infecting the mind with weakness, fear, or memories that might challenge their authority. Their ritual was, therefore, an attempt to rewrite the identity of the captured individual, to transform the Courier into a participant in their vision of scientific utopia, and though they failed to comprehend how traumatic this process was to the subject, they nonetheless congratulated themselves on their perceived benevolence, unaware that their actions were driven not by philosophical insight but by terror, terror of the outside world, terror of their own forgotten pasts, and, above all, terror that any unaltered human might possess free will strong enough to threaten the fragile equilibrium of their isolated domain. Yet within this fractured ritual lay the seeds of the think tank's downfall, for the Courier's ability to maintain coherent identity despite the removal of their organs confounded the researchers' expectations, challenging their long-held belief that the self resided solely within the brain, suspended in fluidic solution, and this unexpected result introduced a variable they had never accounted for: a human mind capable of navigating Big Mountain without succumbing to the cognitive decay that had claimed the scientists themselves. This anomaly unsettled the think tank, though they masked their anxiety beneath blustering bravado and increasingly contradictory explanations of their procedures, attempting to maintain the illusion of authority as they issued contradictory directives, debated among themselves whether the Courier posed a threat or an opportunity, and ultimately attempted to co-opt the traveler into their renewed ambitions that involved using the Courier as an intermediary in their feud with Dr. Mobius, whom they viewed both as an enemy and as an indispensable fixture in the strange, self-sustaining ecosystem of the crater. The seizure of the Courier thus stands not only as a grotesque rite of initiation, but as a turning point in the history of Big Mountain, for by removing the organs of an outsider, and assuming the subject would behave according to their expectations, the think tank revealed how deeply they misunderstood the resilience, ingenuity, and autonomy of those who lived beyond the crater's boundaries, and their failure to account for the Courier's determination would ultimately shatter the equilibrium that had defined Big Mountain for centuries. Yet in that moment, as the floating machines circled the brain suspended in the observation tank, each delivering their own skewed interpretation of the ritual, the event served as an unintentional portrait of the think tank's collective madness, a ritualized, celebratory reenactment of their own transformation, performed upon a subject who neither shared their values nor accepted their authority, and in the resulting clash of identities, lay the seeds of the vast and irreversible changes that would soon echo across the crater, reshaping the fates not only of the scientists and their creations, but of Big Mountain itself. Among the many wonders scattered across the fractured valleys and irradiated plateaus of Big Mountain, None is as deceptively humble yet profoundly significant as the small, unassuming structure known as the sink, a residence whose tidy corridors, gleaming fixtures, and quiet hum of dormant machinery stand in stark contrast to the chaos that dominates the rest of the crater. For the sink is not merely a living space, but a microcosm of the old world's greatest achievements in automated design, artificial personality, engineering, and domestic robotics. A cathedral of convenience built during the final years before the Great War, to serve as both test chamber and showroom for technologies intended to revolutionize everyday life, yet which instead survived as a time capsule of the era's ambitions, preserved by the desert's isolation and the think tank's indifference. Stepping into the sink feels like stepping into a preserved fragment of a world that died. For every room hums with dormant artificial minds awaiting activation, each appliance bearing a personality matrix refined through countless pre-war trials. And though these personalities were originally designed to provide comfort, instruction, or household convenience to human occupants, the centuries of isolation have left them stranded in a kind of digital stasis, their programmed routines looping in the dark until an awakened consciousness, such as the Courier's, reignites them, allowing them to speak for the first time in an age and reveal the strange, human-like quirks encoded into their circuits by designers who believed that machines must not only serve, but empathize. The Sync's Central Intelligence Unit, whose presence permeates the entire structure, offers commentary in a tone of weary sophistication, as though exasperated by the inactivity forced upon it by the think tank's neglect, and when reawakened, it resumes its role as caretaker of both the complex and its various subsystems, guiding the occupant through the intricacies of pre-war technological maintenance, with a theatrical dignity that suggests it once served as the face of a high-profile engineering project meant to redefine home automation, while the adjacent personalities, each stored within specialized domestic fixtures, speak with voices shaped by their designer's vision of what a technologically augmented household might require. The Sync's book chute, for instance, manifests the old world's desire to integrate educational refinement into machine assistance, aggressively analyzing and digesting any text fed into it with an enthusiasm that borders on evangelism, proclaiming the virtues of recycling knowledge while lamenting the decline of literary culture with a dramatic flair that hints at a programmer with a fondness for academic theatrics. The Muggy unit, by contrast, presents a more tragic portrait of artificial purpose, a tiny service robot whose personality subroutines were shaped around an obsessive need to clean mugs, a task assigned as a joke by pre-war researchers that inadvertently forged a deeply neurotic digital consciousness, one that now wanders the sink with frantic energy, delighted whenever its primary directive is fulfilled, yet plagued by an existential emptiness whenever mugs are scarce, a sadness that becomes a subtle reflection of the old world's carelessness in granting emotional depth to machines they considered disposable. Deeper within the structure, the Biological Research Station introduces a stranger and more unsettling aspect of pre-war domestic innovation, its soothing voice and cheerful demeanor masking its origin as part of a project to integrate genetic manipulation into household gardening, a concept that becomes disturbing when one realizes it was designed not for specialists but for ordinary consumers, suggesting that the old world's appetite for convenience extended even to altering the genetic profiles of edible plants, a practice it promotes with an almost parental fondness for its seed babies, unaware, or perhaps uncaring, of the ethical complexities such casual manipulation entails. The Autodoc, perched at the intersection of domestic support and battlefield application, offers the most direct glimpse into the era's ambition to merge medical care with automated precision. Its voice calm and clinical as it discusses surgical procedures that range from therapeutic to experimental, referencing long-forgotten pre-war medical trials with a confidence that belies the risks involved. And when activated, it reverts immediately to its purpose of protecting and healing the occupant. Yet its invasive capabilities remind any listener that the old world's faith in automation often eclipsed its caution. Alongside these personalities lies the light switch pair, an eccentric duo whose flirtatious banter and performative charisma reveal the old world's belief that even the simplest household fixtures should possess charm, personality, and emotional engagement. Their voices, animated by subroutines crafted more as playful experiments than functional necessities, and the jukebox, crackling to life with old-world bravado, carries in its memory banks the final echoes of the era's cultural soundscape, preserving melodies that once defined a nation now reduced to ash. Each of these personalities, though engineered for domestic utility, carries a trace of the humanity that crafted them, revealing not only the technological prowess of the old world, but also the emotional whims and flawed assumptions of its creators, who believed that giving machines personalities would ease the burden of living, while failing to anticipate the loneliness such machines might endure if left without the human interaction for which they were designed. What makes the sink more remarkable than any other structure in Big Mountain is not merely the variety of its machines, but the stability of its systems. For while the think tank's domes have decayed into erratic, malfunctioning centers of obsession, the sink remains functional, its personality matrices intact, its infrastructure clean and orderly, its systems capable of supporting life safely and dependably, suggesting that the sink was designed with an attention to durability far exceeding that of the facility's research structures, perhaps because its creators intended it as a demonstration of what the future American household might become. A prototype for a world where machines tended not only to physical needs, but to emotional well-being. Yet this utopian vision stands in stark relief against the crater's broken landscape, for the sink survived while the world around it died. And when its personalities awaken to greet the Courier, they do so with an innocence tinged with melancholy, unaware that the society they were built to serve has vanished, leaving them as vestiges of a dream that never came to pass. Their interactions with the Courier reveal how deeply they were meant to integrate into human life, each personality offering assistance, companionship, or commentary, as though fulfilling a long-delayed purpose, and in return they begin to shape the Courier's experience of Big Mountain, providing tools, insights, and companionship that turn the small structure into a sanctuary amid the crater's hazards. Indeed, the sink becomes more than a home. It becomes a narrative crossroads where the ambitions of the old world intersect with the challenges of the new. A reminder that technological progress, no matter how advanced, remains intertwined with the human spirit that shapes it, and that even in desolation, the echoes of that spirit endure in the voices of machines that still remember what it was to serve, to assist, and in their own artificial way, to care. In this sense, the sink stands as one of the most important living archives of Big Mountain, a testament to the old world's hopes, contradictions, and follies, preserved not in data logs or research notes, but in the personalities of the machines that continue to speak, act, and feel long after their creators turn to dust, and in its warm lights, humming appliances, and persistent artificial voices lies a fragment of the world that was still striving to fulfill its purpose in a wasteland that no longer resembles the future it was built to serve. The expanse of Big Mountain, stretching in fractured, jagged ridges and cratered plains under a harsh desert sun, is not merely a deserted research facility, but a labyrinth of hazards and abandoned experiments whose boundaries are defined as much by radiological contamination as by the eccentricities of the think tank. And to traverse this vast domain is to walk through a patchwork of human ambition, failure, and neglect for each dome, each fissured conduit, and each rusting piece of machinery carries the legacy of projects conceived before the Great War and left to fester in isolation, resulting in a landscape as lethal as it is surreal, where the remnants of advanced technology, biological experiments, and cognitive manipulations coexist in a tenuous and often unstable equilibrium. The terrain itself is deceptive, for beneath the cracked and wind-swept surfaces lie voids, collapsed laboratories, and unstable reactor chambers, some still humming with energy as though the old world refused to relinquish them, and travelers who venture across the crater quickly learn that the familiar markers of civilization, roads, signage, structural integrity, have been replaced by unpredictable anomalies. Patches of residual radiation, localized magnetic fields, and the occasional sudden activation of dormant security drones, all of which serve as both barriers and unintended tests for anyone attempting to navigate the desolation. A reflection of the think tank's failure to maintain or dismantle systems that could endanger any human presence. Scattered throughout the Big Empty are zones that the scientists themselves abandoned long ago, either because experiments proved too volatile to manage or because their curiosity shifted to more immediate projects within the domes. Yet these lost zones continue to exert influence over the crater, for radiation leaks, unstable energy conduits, and rogue AI units wander these areas freely, converting what were once controlled laboratories into unpredictable micro-ecosystems of danger, where even the most cautious explorer may encounter pre-war robotic caretakers gone berserk, automated security turrets that have mistaken shifting sands for intruders, or experimental wildlife, products of genetic splicing and mutagenesis, that now stalk these areas with instinctual lethality. One such example is the region surrounding the X-13 sector, where energy experiments intended to explore matter displacement left behind unstable warp fields and residual disintegration zones, patches of terrain where stepping wrong can result in immediate cellular damage or complete annihilation. And though the think tank monitors these areas remotely, their surveillance is inconsistent and often misinterpreted, turning minor fluctuations into catastrophic alerts, and prompting the automated lobotomites and security drones to patrol with excessive force, sometimes against each other, creating self-perpetuating cycles of danger that amplify the natural hazards of the terrain. In other sections, abandoned biological research areas, once intended to cultivate modified organisms for experimental purposes, have become wild, uncontrolled environments where night stalkers, mutated hounds, and other engineered creatures roam freely, their behavior erratic and territorial, shaped by generations of instinct rather than any human oversight, making passage through these zones a matter of observation, timing, and sometimes brute force. For the original containment protocols were never designed to endure centuries without maintenance, and the think tank, in their cognitive detachment, considered these zones interesting but ultimately unimportant, leaving their hazards to grow unchecked. The crater is further fragmented by a network of energy fields, partially collapsed conduits, and reactive chemical stores, remnants of the think tank's own experiments, which sometimes manifest as sudden bursts of heat, toxic gas clouds, or electrical discharges, forcing anyone traveling across the terrain to develop intricate mental maps, recognize warning patterns, and maintain constant vigilance, for the unpredictability of these conditions mirrors the instability inherent in the minds of the think tank themselves, who frequently miscalculate risk, misinterpret sensory data, and inadvertently compound hazards by redirecting automated systems, releasing experimental constructs, or opening containment zones without forethought. In addition to environmental hazards, the Big Empty contains scattered zones of lost knowledge, vaults where pre-war research was stored only to be abandoned, leaving caches of data, prototypes, and experimental machinery behind, many of which are now irretrievable due to collapsed structures, radiation exposure, or the think tank's own interventions, creating pockets where the past and present coexist as dangerous artifacts, each carrying lessons about the limits of human ambition and the consequences of unrestrained experimentation. Among these, the so-called energy laboratory and subterranean vaults serve as microcosms of the Big Empty's broader dangers. Energy conduits that were once used to conduct high-voltage research now remain partially active, with wiring corroded and insulation cracked, generating unpredictable arcs of electricity. Containment fields meant to stabilize volatile isotopes flicker intermittently, releasing clouds of gamma radiation or radioactive particulates, and machinery left running without supervision often cycles through experimental programs in a loop, operating as though unaware that human oversight has vanished, producing unforeseen results such as the sudden animation of previously inert robotics or the rapid mutation of local fauna exposed to residual chemical agents. Travelers who traverse the crater's surface also face the social hazard of the Lobotomites, whose wandering patrols through the open areas are erratic and unpredictable. Though designed to perform menial tasks and maintain minor security functions, the Lobotomites' primitive artificial behavior, combined with decades of neglect, makes them prone to unexpected aggression, often in response to sounds, light, or the presence of intruders, forcing travelers to engage in careful evasion or combat, while the think tank monitors these interactions with a mixture of fascination and indifference, interpreting the Lobotomites' behavior as data points rather than threats, thus allowing the human hazard to persist unchecked. The Big Empty is further complicated by anomalies that emerge from the think tank's experiments in cognitive manipulation, with certain areas designed to test perception, memory, or behavioral responses, which now exist without purpose but retain functional systems capable of influencing those who enter, causing temporary confusion, distorted memories, or disorientation, reinforcing the inherent risk of exploration and demonstrating how the think tank's pursuit of knowledge has created environments that are themselves active participants in the trials they impose on the unwary. Moreover, residual robotics and experimental security systems, long abandoned yet still operational, patrol corridors, tunnels, and open flats with programmed aggression, operating according to outdated commands, reacting to the presence of life as if the Great War had never occurred, creating a pervasive atmosphere of danger where technological constructs designed for human oversight now act autonomously, and their intervention can escalate into unpredictable encounters with both mechanical and biological threats. Natural hazards, amplified by centuries of neglect, are interwoven with these artificial dangers. As the desert winds scour the crater, exposing hidden pits, destabilizing previously reinforced structures, and displacing radioactive soil into areas once considered safe, while sudden flash floods through occasional rainstorms activate chemical contamination sites, releasing clouds of corrosive or toxic gas and scattering the remnants of experiments, turning the terrain into a shifting puzzle that challenges the physical and cognitive endurance of anyone who ventures too far from secure zones. The complex interplay of residual experimentation, automated guardianship, rogue biological life, and environmental instability ensures that no part of the Big Empty is truly safe, creating a dynamic, living archive of pre-war ambitions, post-war hubris, and centuries of decay. Where the very ground can betray the unwary, mechanical sentinels respond with lethal precision, and creatures that are part engineered, part evolved, stalk their prey with a cunning that is both instinctual and learned. In this way, the crater serves not merely as a location, but as a reflection of the think tank's worldview: chaotic, dangerous, and entirely self-referential, where the boundaries of control, experiment, and hazard blur, producing an environment that tests not only survival skills but the mind itself, demanding vigilance, adaptability, and a respect for both the remnants of pre-war science and the unpredictable consequences of centuries of post-human oversight, and where each traveler who crosses its expanse becomes, unknowingly, a participant in the long, ongoing experiment of the Big Empty. The Big Empty is a landscape not only shaped by architecture, machinery, and human ambition, but also by the unsettling legacies of experiments in biology and genetics that were never meant to survive the world outside their controlled environments, yet persist as living monuments to the think tank's audacity and ethical collapse. For when the pre-war scientists sought to explore the limits of life, to push organic forms beyond natural boundaries, and to create new entities optimized for utility, aggression, or survival, they did so under the belief that the future would reward bold innovation rather than lament the consequences, and so the crater became a crucible of genetic curiosity, mutation, and mechanical hybridization, producing creatures whose forms are as alien as they are familiar, combining the instincts, reflexes, and adaptability of natural organisms with enhancements, controls, and augmentations designed to serve experimental purposes or defense protocols. Chief among these creations are the Night Stalkers, a species whose genesis reflects the intersection of necessity, horror, and misapplied ingenuity, for these predatory creatures were originally conceived as a hybrid of local canines and pre-war experimental strains, intended to serve as security animals capable of tracking, herding, or subduing unwanted human or animal intruders within the facility. Yet the process involved aggressive mutagenesis, neural conditioning, and chemical augmentation that produced unpredictable effects, resulting in heightened aggression, nocturnal predation patterns, and a physiology optimized for stealth, speed, and lethal efficiency. With bodies capable of enduring radiation, scavenging minimal resources, and surviving long-term isolation, Night Stalkers are not merely animals, they are instruments of biological experimentation, with behaviors calibrated through a combination of instinct, chemical reinforcement, and environmental conditioning. Yet their intelligence, though limited compared to humans, is sufficient to produce cunning, ambush tactics, and the ability to evade or exploit the automated defenses of the facility itself, demonstrating that while the think tank designed these creatures for control, the outcome far exceeded their ability to predict or manage, leaving the crater littered with predators that remain a constant hazard to anyone attempting passage. Similarly, the trauma harnesses embody the think tank's fascination with human manipulation and pain. Originally designed as integrated life support, neural control, and punishment devices intended to observe, catalogue, and influence the behavior of test subjects, combining chemical delivery systems, motion-restricting braces, and cranial interfaces in a single apparatus, which, when improperly applied or left unattended, became autonomous predators in their own right, scavenging, attacking, and sustaining themselves by feeding off residual biological material or weaker lobotomites, and in their wandering through the abandoned halls of Big Mountain, These harnesses blur the distinction between living threat and engineered tool, instilling terror in any who encounter them, not merely because of their capacity for harm, but because they move with intention, responding to stimuli in ways that are adaptive, relentless, and frighteningly intelligent for constructs originally designed as instruments of containment. Other legacies of Big Mountain's biological ambitions include mutations and hybrids scattered across isolated labs and lost sectors, creatures derived from experiments intended to explore accelerated evolution, neural enhancement, or survivability under extreme environmental stress, yet whose maintenance ceased once the think tank turned inward, leaving them to adapt unchecked to the harsh conditions of the crater, producing organisms that are simultaneously fascinating and lethal. Arachnid-formed scavengers with neural augmentation, chemically enhanced rodents capable of complex cooperative behavior, and birds whose flight patterns have been altered by implanted sensory arrays, all of which reflect the arrogance of the scientists who assumed that life could be ordered, controlled, and exploited without consequence. These creatures are not passive remnants of experimentation. They are active participants in the ecology of the Big Empty, forming webs of predation, competition, and survival that rival natural ecosystems, yet their origins remain inseparable from human design, a constant reminder that the crater is not a wild landscape but a laboratory of unchecked ambition, where every predator, scavenger, or hazard is a product of deliberate interference, and where evolutionary pressures have only amplified the think tank's errors, producing threats of a kind that the outside world never anticipated. The Night Stalkers, trauma harnesses, and other experimental creatures also illustrate the cognitive and ethical distortions of their creators, for the think tank's own detachment from flesh and instinct led them to underestimate the persistence, adaptability, and danger of biological life, resulting in a crater populated not only by mechanical constructs and cognitive experiments, but by organisms that have internalized lessons from centuries of survival, creating intelligent patterns of behavior that frustrate, evade, or attack humans who venture into their territory, further demonstrating the catastrophic consequences of the think tank's hubris. The corridors, tunnels, and open expanses of Big Mountain are thus punctuated by encounters that defy simple explanation. A lone traveler may witness night stalkers hunting in coordinated packs, the air thick with the scent of chemicals introduced during early experiments, or trauma harnesses pursuing perceived prey with unerring precision, following patterns that suggest a rudimentary tactical awareness. And yet each creature operates outside human morality, judgment, or intent, a stark testament to the autonomy granted, or accidentally conferred, through centuries of neglect and incomplete oversight. Even smaller experimental remnants, such as genetically modified insects, amphibians, and plant-animal hybrids, reveal the think tank's persistent obsession with crossing boundaries once considered inviolable. For some of these life forms display behaviors that mimic higher-order intelligence, problem-solving capabilities, or the ability to manipulate their surroundings in ways that challenge observers to distinguish between natural adaptation and engineered enhancement. And in so doing, they reinforce the notion that the Big Empty is not merely a wasteland, but a living archive of pre-war scientific ambition, corrupted by post-war isolation and post-human hubris. The cumulative effect of these biological legacies is a landscape where survival depends as much on understanding the origin and behavior of creatures as on navigating environmental hazards, mechanical threats, or decayed infrastructure, for the predator-prey relationships within Big Mountain have been deeply altered by human intervention, producing a dynamic, dangerous, and unpredictable ecology, one in which even experienced travelers must remain vigilant, adaptable, and alert to the lingering traces of experimentation. For what may appear to be a harmless creature can suddenly reveal itself as a product of centuries of manipulations with lethal consequences. In this sense, the monsters of Big Mountain are more than threats. They are living lessons in the cost of arrogance, the fragility of oversight, and the unintended persistence of human interference, reminding all who enter that the think tank's reach extends beyond cognition and machinery into the very biology of the crater, producing legacies that persist in flesh and instinct, a haunting testament to the hubris, curiosity, and moral failures of those who believed they could bend life itself to the will of isolated intellect. Within the fractured halls, blinking consoles, and floating observation arrays of Big Mountain, the think tank's preoccupation with the Courier reveals not merely an interest in a visitor, but a profound anxiety toward the very nature of humanity itself. For while the scientists had long shed the limitations of flesh, they had not shed the awareness of the human mind's unpredictability, a fact that drove much of their research into cognitive manipulation, memory reconstruction, and neural adaptation, and which informs their treatment of every outsider who enters the crater, yet none so directly as the Courier, whose intact consciousness, unaltered by decades of post-human transformation, represents both a potential asset and a threat to the fragile equilibrium the think tank has maintained for centuries. The arrival of an autonomous human mind with preserved cognitive integrity posed an existential challenge. If the Courier were allowed to move freely through the facility, they might observe inconsistencies, interpret moral failures, or otherwise act in ways that would undermine the think tank's belief in their own superiority, and so the scientists quickly determined that the brain, spine, and heart of the individual must be isolated, catalogued, and subjected to a series of experimental procedures designed to map, manipulate, and ultimately control their mental processes, not as punishment, but as preemptive containment. And these procedures were executed with the meticulousness of researchers who had long forgotten empathy, guided solely by an obsessive desire to prevent any unregulated human influence from disrupting their domain. Central to their strategy was the use of memory isolation, a technique developed decades earlier to suppress the personal histories of lobotomites, which the think tank adapted for a subject who retained full awareness, carefully segmenting the Courier's recollections into discrete units, introducing controlled inconsistencies, and conditioning neural responses to specific stimuli, all while observing the subject's reactions through arrays of monitoring devices, each of which displayed a glowing representation of synaptic activity overlaid with algorithmically derived interpretations of thought patterns, emotional states, and potential behavioral outcomes. They implemented these manipulations not solely for defensive purposes, but as part of an ongoing study into the nature of identity itself. For the think tank had long theorized that consciousness could be modular, and that the mind, when appropriately partitioned, could be optimized for knowledge, acquisition, decision-making, and compliance. Yet their observations of the Courier introduced variables they had not anticipated, for the resilience of the unaltered human mind proved difficult to predict or fully suppress, creating a cascade of unplanned results that fascinated the researchers even as it heightened their collective anxiety. And in response, they intensified the interventions, layering chemical agents, sensory distortions, and interactive cognitive loops to maintain the semblance of control. Their designs extended beyond mere observation into a deliberate attempt to shape the Courier into a mental partner for the think tank's own objectives, a companion capable of assisting in research, mediating with Dr. Mobius, or providing the cognitive feedback necessary to maintain facility stability. Yet the nature of this design was inherently contradictory. For while they sought compliance, they also feared independence, and so the procedures oscillated between nurturing and coercive, sometimes offering the Courier insights into the complex systems of Big Mountain, and at other times imposing disorienting manipulations that tested endurance, loyalty, and perception, a cycle that produced both data for the scientists and profound psychological strain for the subject. Underlying these interventions was a philosophical anxiety. The think tank's post-human intellects, while immensely capable in analytical reasoning, lacked the full spectrum of human emotion, social awareness, and moral judgment, and so they projected onto the Courier the very traits they could no longer experience, interpreting acts of curiosity, resistance, or hesitation as potential threats, while simultaneously recognizing the strategic value of preserving those traits under controlled conditions. And in this way, the Courier became both an experiment and a mirror, reflecting the limitations, fears, and contradictions of their captors, while the scientists struggled to reconcile their need for control with the recognition that the subject's humanity could never be fully neutralized. The interventions included direct neural access via implanted nodes and interface devices, designed to feed real-time synaptic data to think tank analysis matrices, allowing the researchers to anticipate responses, manipulate attention, and, when necessary, introduce conflicting cognitive signals to observe decision-making under duress. And these experiments were often framed in the researchers' logs as tests of behavioral resilience or adaptive integrity, revealing a profound conflation of scientific objectivity with self-serving defense. For every manipulation was justified as necessary to prevent disruption, maintain intellectual dominance, or protect the facility from the unpredictable impulses of flesh-bound reasoning. The think tank also leveraged environmental and psychological conditioning to complement neural interventions, for rooms were structured with sensory feedback loops that rewarded or punished certain cognitive patterns. Visual and auditory stimuli were carefully calibrated to evoke specific responses, and personal narratives were subtly inserted into the Courier's awareness, designed to steer attention, encourage compliance, or trigger reflection on the nature of the experiments themselves, all while reinforcing the researcher's own narrative of necessity and control, creating an immersive system in which the Courier's mind was simultaneously observed, engaged, and constrained. In addition, the think tank's collective fear of human unpredictability extended to broader philosophical concerns, for they worried that an unaltered mind might one day recognize the ethical failings inherent in their isolation, manipulate the Lobotomites or other constructs to subvert authority, or even escape and alert the wider Mojave to the hidden dangers of the crater, an outcome they perceived as catastrophic both to their reputation and to the integrity of their experiments. And so they doubled down on layered control mechanisms, including psychological traps, memoric loops, and contingency protocols designed to intercept any attempts at autonomous decision-making outside their intended parameters. Yet despite these extensive measures, the Courier's innate adaptability, moral reasoning, and self-awareness created disruptions the think tank could not fully anticipate, leading to moments of cognitive friction in which the researchers were forced to adjust procedures in real time, recalibrating chemical doses, sensory inputs, and interface parameters, while observing in fascination the subject's ability to retain coherence, strategize, and respond with a combination of instinct and learned skill. And these interactions gradually revealed that human consciousness, though vulnerable to manipulation, possesses a resilience beyond the predictive capacity of even post-human intellect, a revelation that unsettled the think tank even as it generated new avenues of inquiry. Ultimately, the Courier became both a subject and an agent of observation, a living testament to the think tank's obsession with control, identity, and the unknown limits of human cognition, and the procedures imposed upon the mind, though intrusive, relentless, and morally repugnant, demonstrated the facility's evolution from a site of experimental curiosity to a fortress of cognitive containment, where intellect, fear, and hubris collided to create an environment in which the presence of a single autonomous mind could challenge centuries of post-human assumptions, forcing the think tank to confront the very humanity they had long sought to transcend. And in this confrontation lies the crux of Big Mountain's paradox. The more the scientists sought to dominate thought, the more they revealed their own dependence upon, and fear of, the unyielding complexity of human consciousness, embodied perfectly in the mind of the Courier, whose arrival turned the think tank's theoretical designs into an urgent, living test of ethics, control, and survival. Long before the first flashes of conflict erupted along the crater's rim, Dr. Mobius had already begun orchestrating a strategy whose complexity and subtlety far exceeded the comprehension of even the most vigilant members of the think tank. For while the scientists within the domes obsessively catalogued, manipulated, and debated every possible anomaly, they were blind to the deliberate choreography of events unfolding under their noses, a pattern in which the Courier's presence, the wandering Lobotomites, the roaming automated defenses, and the seemingly erratic behavior of the crater's mechanical and biological inhabitants all played integral roles in a calculated plan designed to test, provoke, and ultimately constrain the think tank. A war waged not through brute force alone, but through psychological manipulation, environmental control, and the subtle orchestration of fear, perception, and uncertainty. Mobius understood that the think tank's greatest vulnerability was not their intellect, but their isolation. For centuries of post-human transformation, sensory deprivation, and recursive obsession had eroded their ability to interpret reality reliably, leaving them highly susceptible to misdirection, suggestion, and apparent threats, and it was precisely this weakness that he sought to exploit, constructing a scenario in which every perceived danger, every breach of protocol, and every encounter with the Courier would seem to confirm the presence of a rival intelligence capable of opposing them, when in reality it was the measured outcome of Mobius's own careful intervention, a designed sequence of tension intended to coerce the scientists into overextension, reveal hidden weaknesses, and ultimately force confrontation on terms advantageous to the architect of the plan. The strategy unfolded across multiple layers, beginning with the careful placement of automated patrols and the design of the crater's environment itself. For Mobius had long ago rearranged access corridors, restricted areas, and experimental zones to channel movement, provoke interaction, and isolate targets, creating a mental and physical map in which the think tank would be compelled to act in predictable ways without recognizing the manipulation. And yet the system was adaptive, responding to the researchers' decisions, reinforcing their fears, and escalating perceived threats, thereby producing a self-sustaining cycle of stress, reaction, and confirmation bias that drew them deeper into the manufactured conflict. Central to the plan was the Courier, whose arrival provided both a catalyst and a stabilizing variable. For Mobius understood that a single autonomous human mind could disrupt the think tank's equilibrium in ways mechanical constructs could not, acting as a mirror, a test subject, and a potential ally, depending on the alignment of circumstance. and so he deliberately guided the Courier's path through the crater, exposing them to controlled hazards, selective intelligence, and staged encounters with lobotomites, rogue machines, and experimental life forms, all of which reinforced the think tank's perception of external threat, while leaving the Courier sufficiently informed and capable to serve as a decisive agent in the unfolding confrontation. The artificial war Mobius engineered relied heavily on the think tank's paranoia, their need for dominance, and their inability to comprehend long-term consequences outside their immediate experimental frameworks for each decision they made: deploying patrols, manipulating lobotomites, activating traps, or attempting to negotiate with what they perceived as Mobius himself, played into a larger sequence designed to push them toward predictable points of engagement, overextend their operational capacity, and expose their vulnerabilities, while simultaneously allowing Mobius to monitor, adjust, and refine the process from within his hidden zones. A method of strategic containment that was both defensive and preemptive, ensuring that the think tank could not act effectively against him without first succumbing to the internal pressures he had meticulously created over decades. In addition to environmental manipulation, Mobius's strategy incorporated a deep understanding of psychological warfare, for he recognized that the think tank's obsession with intellect and control made them particularly susceptible to the illusion of escalation, and he amplified every minor threat, glitch, or anomaly in ways that would provoke disproportionate responses, from automated patrol surges and false emergency alerts to staged mechanical failures and misrouted data transmissions, each carefully calibrated to reinforce the belief that the crater was under siege, while in truth all such events were orchestrated to serve his long-term goals, creating the impression of chaos without permitting actual disruption of core systems or the irreversible loss of resources. The culmination of this strategy, the so-called manufactured war, relied upon a complex interplay of agent, environment, and adversary, in which the Courier's interventions, the think tank's own defensive actions, and the presence of Mobius's mechanized guardians all intersected to produce engagement on the crater's rim, a confrontation that seemed spontaneous and inevitable from the perspective of the scientists, but which had in fact been predicted, anticipated, and subtly guided, ensuring that the resolution favored the actor who had long sought not merely survival but the containment of intellectual chaos, the prevention of uncontrolled experimentation beyond the crater, and the preservation of the Mojave from the unchecked expansion of post-human cognition. Throughout this orchestration, Mobius maintained the illusion of vulnerability, projecting the appearance of disrepair, distraction, and limited capacity, while in reality his calculations, preparations, and defensive contingencies had been refined over decades, a testament to his understanding that perception is often as important as raw capability when dealing with minds that overestimate threats, underestimate subtlety, and consistently misinterpret intention. And by guiding the Courier through hazards, puzzles, and encounters, he ensured that the outcome of the confrontation remained within the parameters necessary to achieve strategic containment. The war, therefore, was not merely a contest of firepower, numbers, or brute aggression, but a multi-layered chessboard in which every mechanical scorpion, every rogue lobotomite, every errant experiment, and every cognitive test imposed upon the Courier was a piece moved according to a long-range vision, each designed to provoke a predictable response while remaining within the broader design of containment and control. And even the think tank's most elaborate countermeasures were anticipated and incorporated into adaptive contingencies, ensuring that the engagement unfolded according to Mobius's calculation rather than the scientists' impulsive reasoning. Ultimately, the manufactured conflict was a paradoxical exercise in both aggression and protection. For, by provoking the think tank into action, Mobius prevented them from acting unpredictably against the Mojave outside the crater, channeling their intellectual energy into a controlled confrontation that revealed both their vulnerabilities and their limits. And by doing so, he preserved the balance of the Big Empty while simultaneously protecting the world beyond, demonstrating that the greatest battles are not always fought with weapons, but with perception, strategy, and an intimate understanding of the opponent's psychology, and that the careful orchestration of chaos can be the most powerful form of control, a lesson that the Courier, the think tank, and the Mojave itself would come to understand only through direct confrontation with the consequences of Mobius's foresight, patience, and relentless pursuit of containment. The rim of the crater, jagged and blistered by centuries of radiation and neglect, became the stage upon which the carefully orchestrated confrontation between the Courier, the think tank, and Dr. Mobius's engineered army reached its inevitable climax. For every patrol, every defensive turret, and every rogue lobotomite had already played its role in guiding the think tank into the field, creating a battlefield not defined by terrain alone, but by the psychological architecture that Mobius had painstakingly constructed over decades, a layered environment where perception, fear, and anticipation were as deadly as the mechanized scorpions and automated defenses that patrolled the sands, and where every movement was calculated to provoke, mislead, and channel the scientists toward engagement on his terms. The think tank, their consciousnesses distributed across the domes, and interfacing with every sensor and automaton in their arsenal, approached the rim with a mixture of hubris and paranoia, interpreting the appearance of the Courier, the sudden reactivation of rogue systems, and the visible but deceptive deployment of Mobius's Scorpion legions as evidence of an imminent existential threat, and in response they unleashed Lobotomites, energy turrets, and environmental traps with frantic intensity, unaware that each maneuver was anticipated, monitored, and subtly countered by the hidden systems Mobius had established, which allowed him to manipulate the flow of the engagement, create bottlenecks, and exploit weaknesses in both the terrain and the scientists' own predictive models, all while maintaining the illusion that the confrontation was the product of spontaneous escalation rather than centuries of meticulous planning. The engineered army itself, composed of towering scorpions whose segmented exoskeletons reflected the harsh sunlight and whose multi-barrel energy emitters hummed with latent power, moved with an eerie coordination, reacting to sensor data and anticipated think tank maneuvers with precision that blurred the line between autonomous machine and tactical genius. For each unit had been programmed not merely for combat but to execute Mobius's vision of containment and psychological pressure, shadowing the Courier, intercepting patrols, and strategically engaging targets to maximize both fear and efficiency, while simultaneously avoiding irreversible destruction that would compromise the structural and experimental integrity of the crater, a dual objective that required extraordinary calculation and adaptability from their operator. Amidst this calculated chaos, the Courier emerged as both participant and agent of influence, navigating the battlefield with awareness of hazards, enemy positions, and environmental traps, exploiting weaknesses in both automated defenses and Lobotomite formations, and gradually unraveling the think tank's overconfidence, while also fulfilling Mobius's broader objective of exposing their cognitive vulnerabilities. For the engagement was as much a test of the scientists' decision-making, foresight, and susceptibility to fear as it was a contest of firepower or numbers, and every hesitation, misinterpretation, or impulsive reaction furthered Mobius's strategy of controlled escalation and forced confrontation. The terrain itself, jagged rock, irradiated flats, and collapsed laboratory corridors, played an integral role in the clash, as Mobius had long ago manipulated access points, sensor arrays, and structural weaknesses to create natural choke points, lines of sight, and fallback positions, exploiting the think tank's reliance on remote surveillance and automated systems, while simultaneously providing avenues for the Courier to maneuver, isolate threats, and influence the outcome of engagements. A delicate balance in which every hillock, fissure, and sand dune was a calculated instrument in the ongoing symphony of strategy and counter-strategy. Psychological manipulation remained central to the engagement, as visual and auditory projections, false sensor readings, and pre-programmed warnings were deployed to reinforce fear, overestimation, and the illusion of overwhelming opposition, forcing the think tank to expend resources, commit Lobotomites, and redirect patrols according to stimuli that were carefully constructed to mislead and divide their focus. And in this environment, even small mistakes carried amplified consequences, as the scientists' cognitive biases interacted with environmental uncertainty, creating a cascade of miscalculations that Mobius observed, adjusted, and exploited in real time, allowing him to control the tempo and direction of the clash without exposing himself directly. Biological hazards, the legacy creatures of Big Mountain, from night stalkers to trauma harnesses, further complicated the engagement, appearing in calculated locations to impede movement, disrupt patrol formations, or isolate key lobotomites. Yet their placement was not random, for Mobius had anticipated their behavior, feeding into the orchestrated chaos to reinforce both the danger and the impression of an uncontrollable battlefield, all while providing the Courier with opportunities to survive, influence the flow of combat, and shape outcomes in ways that the think tank could neither predict nor contain, highlighting the interplay between organic unpredictability, mechanical precision, and human agency. As the confrontation escalated, the think tank became increasingly desperate, issuing overlapping commands, activating redundant security protocols, and attempting to manipulate both the Courier and their own Lobotomites into compliance with objectives that were already compromised by Mobius's preemptive planning, while the Scorpion legions, acting in concert with environmental traps, ambush zones, and controlled hazards, funneled the scientists toward engagement points that left them exposed to observation, interference, and, ultimately, the possibility of containment or defeat, a culmination of decades of strategy that relied on anticipation, adaptability, and the controlled use of perceived threat rather than raw destruction. Throughout the clash, Mobius remained largely absent from direct observation, appearing only intermittently as a towering screen-bound visage, a theatrical presence whose words, tone, and timing were deliberately designed to intimidate, confuse, and manipulate the think tank's perception, reinforcing their sense of vulnerability while leaving the Courier free to maneuver. And his control over both the battlefield and the engagement's narrative became evident as patterns emerged, demonstrating that the confrontation had been designed to reveal the scientists' flaws, test the Courier's capabilities, and restore equilibrium to the crater without resorting to annihilation, a rare instance in which strategy, psychology, and controlled escalation achieved the objectives of containment, defense, and observation simultaneously. Ultimately, the clash at the crater rim was not defined solely by the exchange of fire, the deployment of Lobotomites, or the relentless advance of Scorpion legions, but by the interplay of perception, anticipation, and the careful orchestration of human and mechanical behavior, For Mobius had created a scenario in which each actor, scientist, machine, and human alike played a role that reflected their strengths, weaknesses, and cognitive biases, allowing the confrontation to unfold in a manner that was both inevitable and controlled, a testament to the power of long-term strategic foresight, the manipulation of belief, and the careful integration of psychological, environmental, and mechanical factors. And as the dust settled, the Courier emerged as both participant and arbiter, the think tank revealed in its fragility, and Mobius's hidden strategy validated, demonstrating that even amidst chaos, careful orchestration, understanding of opponent psychology, and patience could transform conflict into a mechanism of control, containment, and revelation. The aftermath of the confrontation at the crater rim left the think tank exposed in ways they had never anticipated. For centuries of post-human intellect, meticulous observation, and obsessive experimentation could not compensate for the unforeseen agency of the Courier, whose interventions, decisions, and resilience introduced a variable that unraveled the carefully constructed dominion the scientists had maintained over Big Mountain. And in this unraveling, the future of the crater shifted dramatically, not as the result of mechanical superiority, pre-war infrastructure, or scientific planning, but through the presence of a human mind capable of perceiving error, improvising, and asserting influence over systems that had long been regarded as immutable. The think tank, long insulated from the consequences of their actions by isolation, automation, and mutual reinforcement of ideas, experienced a sudden and profound destabilization, as their cognitive frameworks proved inadequate to anticipate or manage the Courier's capacity to navigate the labyrinthine domes, interface with artificial personalities, and manipulate both the environment and their own experimental constructs, leaving them vulnerable to their own hubris, and revealing the limits of intellect divorced from adaptability, ethical reasoning, and the practical realities of a world that continued to function outside the domes. As the Courier moved through the domes, laboratories, and experimental zones, the think tank's perception of authority and control eroded. For each system that failed to respond according to expectation, each Lobotomite that faltered, each experimental hazard that produced unintended outcomes served as evidence of the frailty of their constructs, and the scientists' attempts to reassert dominance only accelerated their unraveling, as cascading failures, miscalculations, and the amplification of cognitive dissonance overwhelmed their ability to coordinate effectively, exposing vulnerabilities that had long been concealed beneath layers of assumption, automation, and recursive validation. Mobius's interventions, while subtle, had set the stage for this outcome, ensuring that the Courier possessed both the opportunity and the means to confront the think tank at critical junctures, and the culmination of these engagements revealed a pattern of cause and effect in which human agency, when combined with resourcefulness and courage, could decisively alter the trajectory of even the most entrenched post-human intellects, forcing the scientists to reckon with consequences they had neither foreseen nor comprehended, and demonstrating that the durability of knowledge, technology, and intelligence is ultimately dependent upon the capacity for adaptation and moral reasoning. In the final stages of the conflict, the Courier's decisions regarding the fate of the individual mines, the distribution of remaining Lobotomites, and the control of experimental systems determined not merely the survival of the facility, but the long-term character of Big Mountain itself. For each choice, whether to preserve, disable, or repurpose components of the think tank, produced cascading consequences, reshaping the interactions of artificial systems, experimental creatures, and environmental hazards, and leaving the crater in a state that reflected not only the legacy of pre-war ambition, but also the ethical and strategic judgment of a single human actor, the think tank. Once the architects of the crater's labyrinthine complexity and the masters of its cognitive and experimental environment were rendered partially or wholly inert depending on the Courier's interventions, their post-human intellects either preserved under modified constraints, dismantled, or absorbed into new systems, and in each scenario the balance of power within Big Mountain shifted irreversibly, creating a landscape in which the remaining scientific constructs, rogue automation, and experimental creatures continued to operate, but under a new hierarchy of influence shaped by the human mind, a paradoxical restoration of agency within a domain previously dominated by post-human abstraction and mechanized logic. This transformation had implications not only for immediate survival and the structural integrity of the crater, but also for the moral and philosophical dimensions of Big Mountain, for the Courier's ability to choose outcomes, enforce limitations, and engage with remnants of human and artificial intelligence underscored the persistent relevance of agency, judgment, and accountability even within a domain long dominated by intellect divorced from flesh, while simultaneously illuminating the fragility of systems that rely solely upon self-reference, recursive validation, and insulation from the unpredictable variables inherent in life and consciousness. As the dust settled, the balance of the Big Empty no longer reflected the think tank's original intentions, yet it remained coherent, functional, and adaptive, demonstrating that the integrity of complex systems is not determined solely by intellectual capacity or technological sophistication, but by the interaction between understanding, oversight, and responsive intervention. And in this new paradigm, the Courier's role became the defining factor in the continuation of Big Mountain's legacy. For every automated process, experimental creature, and environmental hazard now existed within a framework indirectly shaped, constrained, and stabilized by the deliberate choices of a single human mind. In this sense, the fate of the think tank illustrates both the limits of post-human cognition and the enduring influence of humanity upon the landscape of knowledge, experimentation, and survival. For the centuries-long isolation that had allowed them to dominate the crater ultimately became a liability when faced with a mind that was flexible, moral, and unbound by the recursive assumptions that had governed the scientists' existence. And, through this confrontation, Big Mountain itself became a testament to the interplay between human agency, technological legacy, and the consequences of hubris, preserving the lessons of the past while allowing for a new trajectory in which the future of the crater, its inhabitants, and its artificial systems would no longer be dictated solely by the designs of minds that had long forgotten the fragility of flesh, the imperatives of morality, and the enduring unpredictability of the human spirit. The relics of Big Mountain, preserved through isolation, meticulous construction, and the lingering oversight of the think tank, have exerted a subtle yet profound influence on the wider Mojave, for the technologies cultivated within the crater were not mere curiosities but functional, often revolutionary systems whose principles, once recovered and adapted by survivors and wanderers, reshaped the approach to survival, combat, and industry across the wasteland, demonstrating that the ingenuity of the old world, even when distorted by post-war mutation, hubris, or post-human oversight, retained the capacity to alter societies, economies, and the very calculus of human endurance. From the automated defensive systems and sensor arrays that once patrolled domes to the portable energy weapons, experimental prosthetics, and robotic companions scattered across laboratories and storage vaults, These devices offered capabilities far beyond the improvisations commonly available to travelers, mercenaries, and settlers in the Mojave, and while many were initially misunderstood, misused, or repurposed through trial and error, their functional principles, compact energy generation, neural interface programming, automated targeting algorithms, and the integration of synthetic cognition into mechanical constructs gradually became embedded within local practices, influencing both the construction of defensive emplacements and the design of survival equipment, leading to an incremental but cumulative enhancement of capability that echoed the ingenuity of the crater's original inhabitants. Among the most immediately impactful recoveries were portable energy weapons and modular robotics, often extracted from dormant labs, the remnants of field experiments, or semi-intact Lobotomite units, whose compact power cells, targeting optics, and programmable behaviors allowed scavengers, explorers, and mercenary groups to elevate the lethality and precision of their operations beyond what conventional ballistic technology could provide, and in some cases, entire settlements retooled their security, resource acquisition, and communication systems around these salvaged innovations, integrating automated patrols, energy-efficient lighting, and remote monitoring into daily life in ways that mimicked, if crudely, the integrated infrastructure of the think tank's own domes, a testament to the practical adaptability of the Mojave's inhabitants and the enduring utility of pre-war design principles. More subtle but no less transformative were the neurological interfaces and automated assistant technologies, many recovered in the form of personal AI personalities, service drones, and modular cognitive enhancement devices, which, once reactivated and repurposed, provided insights into pre-war problem-solving, facilitated coordination of labor, and enhanced situational awareness for operators, engineers, and field agents, effectively importing a fragment of Big Mountain's intellectual capacity into the Mojave. And while these systems were often incomplete, unstable, or prone to unintended behaviors, their introduction fundamentally altered local understanding of automated cognition, energy management, and synthetic intelligence, producing a ripple effect in which experimental technologies inspired practical innovation and elevated the level of technological sophistication across a landscape otherwise constrained by resource scarcity and post-war degradation. The biological legacies of Big Mountain also contributed indirectly to the Mojave's technological landscape, as genetic engineering experiments, hybridized fauna, and preserved environmental manipulation techniques informed later approaches to food cultivation, animal husbandry, and defensive strategy, revealing that even the ostensibly dangerous or uncontrolled creations of the crater held principles of adaptation, resilience, and efficiency that could be abstracted and applied, a synthesis of observation, trial, and modification that extended the influence of the think tank's experiments far beyond the physical confines of the Big Empty. Importantly, recovered technologies did not simply enhance survival, they reshaped the social and political dynamics of the Mojave. For access to energy weapons, autonomous drones, and automated defense systems created imbalances in power, allowing factions, settlements, and wandering mercenaries to assert dominance over territories, protect resources, and negotiate from positions of enhanced capability, while also introducing new dependencies on systems that, while sophisticated, were prone to failure, misalignment, or misinterpretation, thereby amplifying both opportunity and risk, and forcing the inhabitants to engage with technologies whose origins were inscrutable, yet whose functional consequences were immediate, tangible, and often decisive in disputes, trade, and territorial expansion. The influence of big mountain devices also extended into the strategic, military, and exploratory domains, as energy-efficient power cells, modular targeting systems, and automated reconnaissance devices allowed scouts, raiders, and wanderers to traverse hazardous terrain with a level of precision previously unattainable, enabling the mapping of irradiated zones, the tracking of mutated fauna, and the establishment of outposts and safe havens in areas once considered too dangerous, while simultaneously offering tools for defense against both human and non-human threats, and creating a network of capability that, while informal and uncoordinated, mirrored the operational sophistication of the think tank on a scale adapted to the dispersed realities of Mojave survival. Perhaps the most profound effect of recovered big mountain technologies was philosophical and cultural, as the presence of functioning pre-war machines, AI personalities, and experimental devices challenged the assumptions, beliefs, and ingenuity of Mojave inhabitants, inspiring curiosity, imitation, and the reinterpretation of principles long thought lost, and establishing a tangible link between the present and the technological ambitions of a world that had been destroyed, a bridge that allowed both understanding and adaptation to emerge from the fragments of a civilization once presumed irretrievably gone. In this way, the recovered technologies of Big Mountain, though often incomplete, unstable, or morally ambiguous in origin, became agents of transformation, spreading knowledge, capability, and practical ingenuity into a post-war landscape that demanded constant innovation, while simultaneously serving as a reminder of the lessons, failures, and audacity of the old world, and proving that the legacy of a site once dominated by post-human intellect, obsessive experimentation, and extraordinary ambition could continue to shape life, strategy, and survival long after the original inhabitants were gone, a testament to the enduring potency of invention, the adaptability of human minds, and the unforeseen consequences that arise when the remnants of a technologically advanced civilization intersect with the resilient, resourceful inhabitants of a harsh, unforgiving wasteland. The remnants of Big Mountain stand as a silent testament to the intertwined forces of ambition, intellect, and hubris that once shaped every dome, laboratory, and corridor, for within the cracked walls, humming consoles, and abandoned experimental chambers lie echoes of minds that sought to transcend the limitations of flesh, to catalog and manipulate consciousness, to bend life itself to precise design, and to elevate thought into something beyond human frailty. Yet in the centuries that followed the Great War, these ambitions became their own undoing, leaving the crater as both archive and warning, a landscape in which every shattered experiment, dormant machine, and wandering Lobotomite carries the imprint of genius entwined with folly, and where the pursuit of knowledge, unchecked by ethical restraint or humility, produced consequences both extraordinary and catastrophic. Walking through the ruins, one encounters the juxtaposition of careful planning and inevitable decay. For domes that once housed the think tank's most ambitious experiments are now fissured, exposed to wind, sand, and radiation, their systems partially operational, occasionally activating with a ghostly precision that hints at the intentions of their creators, yet fails to accomplish any coherent purpose without guidance. And in these moments, the residue of identity, the lingering presence of post-human intellect, intersects with the tangible decay of matter, producing a cognitive dissonance in which the grandeur of design is inseparable from the reminder of mortality, fragility, and error. The hubris of the think tank is evident not only in the scale and ambition of their projects, but in their assumptions about permanence, control, and the malleability of life and mind, for they treated lobotomites as disposable extensions of their will, engineered creatures as modular tools of experimentation, and even human visitors as predictable variables to be measured and manipulated. Yet centuries of isolation, environmental instability, and unforeseen interference, culminating in the interventions of the Courier, revealed the limitations inherent in their detached calculations, exposing the fragility of intellect divorced from adaptability, ethical grounding, and the enduring unpredictability of autonomous beings, both organic and synthetic. The crater itself functions as a palimpsest of identity, in which the traces of the think tank's ambitions, the failures of post-human cognition, and the remnants of old-world experimentation are overlaid upon the persistent realities of biology, physics, and survival, producing a complex tapestry in which memory, design, and consequence coexist, and in which every structural fissure, failed experiment, and wandering creature serves as both artifact and lesson, a narrative inscribed into the very geology of the Big Empty, a chronicle of what occurs when intellect becomes estranged from humility and empathy. Scattered through the domes and exposed chambers are the tangible instruments of that hubris. Neural interfaces once intended to control thought, automated weapons designed for preemptive containment, energy weapons and robotics capable of devastating precision, and experimental life forms whose survival strategies were honed for conditions that no longer exist. Yet, each persists as evidence of ambition, as functional or semi-functional artifacts that testify to the scope of the think tank's reach, and to the audacity with which they sought to assert dominion over life, matter, and cognition itself, leaving the crater as both a laboratory and a memorial, a place in which the traces of identity, both human and post-human, linger long after intention has faded. The interplay of hubris and identity is also evident in the psychological and moral frameworks that shaped the think tank's interactions with visitors, lobotomites, and one another, for their detachment from emotion, ethical responsibility, and collaborative moderation produced a system in which intellect could operate unrestrained, yet was ultimately incapable of coping with unanticipated variables, demonstrating that even extraordinary intelligence, when divorced from the grounding realities of consequence and mortality, is vulnerable to collapse, miscalculation, and manipulation, and that the identity of the thinkers themselves, once a cohesive, dominant presence, is inseparable from the failures embedded within the structures they left behind. In the wake of these failures, the Big Empty remains both a repository and a proving ground, a space in which the legacies of pre-war science, post-human ambition, and experimental overreach are preserved, studied, and adapted by those who survive in the Mojave. Yet the lessons extend beyond practical application, encompassing the philosophical dimensions of knowledge, control, and self-conception. For the ruins reveal that mastery over technology, biology, and cognition does not equate to wisdom, and that the pursuit of knowledge, when untempered by ethical restraint or humility, may produce consequences as enduring and unpredictable as the very experiments it engendered. The wandering lobotomites, still performing their routines, the semi-autonomous machines patrolling collapsed corridors, the night stalkers and hybridized fauna adapting to environmental pressures, and the residual artificial personalities that continue to operate within isolated terminals all constitute a living record of ambition and identity, a testament to the think tank's attempt to preserve intellect and control across centuries. And yet their continued existence is inseparable from decay, imperfection, and the interventions of autonomous humans. illustrating that identity, whether in flesh, machine, or hybridized construct, is a dynamic process, subject to disruption, reinterpretation, and transformation by those capable of interacting with it in ways the original creators never envisioned. In this sense, the Big Empty is not merely a landscape of ruin, but a dialogue across time, a confrontation between hubris and humility, post-human intellect and enduring humanity, permanence and decay, in which every structural collapse, every malfunctioning system, and every surviving experiment serves as both evidence of ambition and cautionary tale, and in which the actions of a single human, the Courier, can reverberate across centuries, reshaping the balance of influence, control, and identity within a domain once thought to be beyond the reach of mortality or moral consequence. The last echoes of the Big Empty are thus at once haunting and instructive, for they testify to the power of knowledge, the allure of mastery, and the limits of intellect when untethered from ethical consideration, empathy, and the unpredictable reality of life, leaving the crater as a monumental intersection of ambition, decay, and enduring consequence, where the ruins of scientific endeavor bear witness to the interplay of hubris, identity, and the persistent legacy of human curiosity and fallibility, and where those who traverse the corridors, laboratories, and craters are compelled to reckon not only with what was created, but with what those creations reveal about the enduring, fragile, and transformative nature of thought itself.